Welcome to Nate's Haunted Hour, where the shadows come alive and the stories of the unknown take hold of your soul. Before we dive into tonight's terrors, make sure to like this video and hit that subscribe button, if you dare. Beware, dear listener, for once you enter, there's no turning back. So turn down the lights and prepare yourself for the fright of your life. You're in for an hour of chills, thrills, and tales that haunt the darkest corners of your mind. This is Nate's Haunted Hour. And don't forget, subscribing may just keep the spirits at bay, for now.
The Blue Door. Part 1. The Invitation. The letter arrived on a breezy October morning, the kind of day that felt nostalgic even without reason. Sarah Monroe had been living in the suburbs for nearly a decade, far removed from the small town she had grown up in. She'd built a life for herself. Nothing grand, just a simple job, a modest apartment, and occasional outings with friends. But despite the years that had passed, something in the back of her mind always tugged at her. Fragments of high school memories, unfinished business, faces long forgotten. The letter caught her by surprise. Written in familiar handwriting, it was an invitation to a reunion of sorts, signed by Marie Harper, a name Sarah hadn't thought about in years. They were never close, but the letter had a warmth to it, like an old friend reaching out after years of silence. "Sarah, it's been too long. I'm hosting a small get-together at my cabin up in the Upper Peninsula, just a handful of old friends before the real reunion. I know you've been busy, but it would mean the world if you could come. We could all use a break from life's chaos, don't you think?" The letter was compelling in its simplicity, a perfect excuse to leave the stress of her job behind for a few days. And there was something about the way Marie wrote, almost as if she knew Sarah needed this. The quiet of the Upper Peninsula, a small group of familiar faces, a chance to escape. After reading it over again, Sarah made her decision. A weekend away couldn't hurt, and maybe reconnecting with the past was exactly what she needed. What she didn't know was that the letter wasn't from Marie at all. It had come from Derek Wilkes, the boy who had been invisible in high school. Except to her. He had watched her from afar, his obsession growing over the years into something dark and twisted. This wasn't a reunion. It was a trap. Part 2, The Blue Door. The drive north was long, taking Sarah deeper into the heart of Michigan's wilderness. The further she drove, the more desolate the landscape became. The small towns disappeared, replaced by endless miles of forest, the autumn leaves a cascade of gold and red. As the hours passed, she found herself alone on the road, the quiet seeping into her mind. By the time she arrived at the cabin, it was late afternoon. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin stood near the edge of a small, placid lake, the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. But what struck her most was the blue door. It was stark, a deep cobalt that stood out against the weathered wood of the cabin, almost too vibrant for its surroundings. Sarah stood there for a moment, staring at the door. Something about it was familiar, but she couldn't place it. She brushed off the unease, telling herself she was just tired from the drive. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. Rustic furniture, a stone fireplace, and the smell of old wood. There were no signs of Marie or anyone else. Maybe she had arrived early. Sarah set her bag down, taking a seat by the window to wait. As the evening crept in, the forest grew darker, the quiet more oppressive. Sarah tried to shake off the feeling of being watched. There was no reason for it. No one was there. And yet, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up as if something was lurking just beyond her sight. She decided to explore the cabin, hoping it would take her mind off the unease. Upstairs, in a small bedroom, she found a stack of old magazines and books. Buried beneath them was something that made her stomach turn, a yearbook from her senior year at Pinebrook High. Pages were dog-eared, names underlined in red ink. Her name was one of them. Her heartbeat quickened. She hadn't thought about high school in years, but the memories came rushing back. The faces, the hallways, and most unsettlingly, Derek Wilkes, He had been a quiet, awkward boy who never quite fit in, always watching from a distance. As she stared at the yearbook, a realization crept over her. Derek had been obsessed with her back then. She remembered the strange letters she used to find in her locker, the unnerving stares in the hallways, and now this yearbook with her name underlined in red. She shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. It couldn't be Derek. He had disappeared after high school, moved away or something. But the unease wouldn't leave her. The feeling of being watched was growing stronger. Part 3, the flashbacks. That night, Sarah barely slept. Her dreams were vivid, haunted by fragments of memories she thought she had left behind. In her mind, she saw Derek, his eyes always on her, his presence lingering in the background. In the dreams, he wasn't just a boy from her past. He was something more, something darker. She woke up several times, her heart racing. Each time she heard sounds outside the cabin, footsteps, the crunch of leaves. But when she looked, there was nothing there. The forest outside was still, silent. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that she heard it, the sound of the door creaking open. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she turned to face the doorway, and there he was. Derek Wilkes. He was older now, but his face was unmistakable. The same haunted eyes, the same unnerving intensity. He stood there in the doorway, his figure silhouetted against the darkness outside. "Sarah?" His voice was soft, almost tender, but it sent a chill down her spine. "I've waited for this moment for so long." Sarah's instincts kicked in. She grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and swung it at him. The lamp shattered against his arm, and she made a run for it, racing past him and out the door. The forest swallowed her immediately. The trees loomed high, and the ground beneath her feet was uneven. She didn't know where she was going. All she knew was that she had to get away. But as she ran, her foot caught on a root, sending her tumbling forward. Her head struck something hard, a rock maybe, and her vision blurred. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the blue door standing stark against the darkness. Part 4, Lost in the Woods. When Sarah came to, it was daylight, but everything around her was a blur. Her head throbbed, and she could feel the wetness of blood trickling down her temple. She struggled to her feet, the world spinning. The forest was dense, disorienting, and for a moment she couldn't remember why she was there. Then it hit her. Derek. The cabin. The blue door. She was alone, somewhere deep in the woods, with no idea how far she had run or which direction the cabin was in. Panic set in. Her mind raced, but she couldn't think clearly. The head injury had jumbled her thoughts, leaving only fragments of memory. The one thing that stood out was the image of the blue door. She started walking, stumbling over roots and underbrush, the dense canopy of trees blocking out most of the sunlight. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, made her jump. She could feel eyes on her, could sense Derek out there somewhere, watching, waiting. Unbeknownst to her, she wasn't alone. Jack Carson, a local hunter who had spent his entire life in these woods, was nearby. Jack wasn't the kind of man who involved himself in other people's business. But something about the signs he had noticed that morning, footprints, broken branches, had piqued his interest. He had seen enough to know someone was in trouble, and his instincts told him to follow the trail. Part 5, The Stalker's Return. Sarah moved through the forest with no real sense of direction, her mind clouded with fear and confusion. She had no idea how long she had been walking, but it felt like hours. The forest seemed endless, each tree blending into the next, and the oppressive silence pressed down on her. But she wasn't alone. Derek was out there, always just out of sight, tracking her. He was in no rush. This was what he had dreamed of for years. Sarah, vulnerable, afraid, and alone. He would enjoy the hunt, savor every moment of her fear. Sarah stumbled again, catching a glimpse of movement in the corner of her eye. She spun around, her heart pounding, but saw nothing. Was it her imagination? Or was Derek closer than she realized? Her head throbbed, the injury clouding her thoughts. She tried to focus, to remember what had happened, but the details were fragmented. All she knew was that she had to keep moving. And then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. But these weren't Derek's. They were heavier, more deliberate. She turned, and through the trees, she saw him. Jack. He was tall, rugged, with a rifle slung over his shoulder. He looked at her with concern, his eyes scanning the forest as if he already knew what was happening. Part 6, Aftermath. Jack Carson stepped forward, his eyes wary as he took in Sarah's disheveled state. Her face was pale, streaked with dirt and dried blood from her head wound. She looked like she was teetering on the edge of collapse. He didn't say a word at first, simply gesturing for her to stay quiet. His instincts had already told him what he needed to know. There was danger lurking nearby. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps as she struggled to speak. He's out there. He's been following me. Please, we have to go." Jack nodded but kept his eyes trained on the trees, his body tense. He knew these woods well, too well to believe they were alone. There was a predator out here, and from the fear in Sarah's voice, he knew this wasn't some wild animal. Before Sarah could say anything more, a sharp rustle in the underbrush sent her heart racing again. Jack moved quickly, positioning himself between her and the sound, his rifle at the ready. His voice was low, calm. "Stay behind me. Don't make any sudden moves." They waited in tense silence, the woods eerily quiet. And then he emerged. Derek stepped into the clearing, his face twisted in a grotesque grin. His clothes were dirty, his hair disheveled, but his eyes, those same haunting eyes from high school, were locked onto Sarah. He didn't seem to notice Jack at first, his focus entirely on her. "Sarah." Derek's voice was low, almost affectionate. "You can't run from me. You belong to me." Jack raised his rifle, his voice firm. "Back away now." Derek's eyes shifted, noticing Jack for the first time. He chuckled, a sound that made Sarah's blood run cold. "This isn't your fight, old man. She's mine, always has been." For a moment, the tension in the air was suffocating. Sarah could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the world narrowing to the standoff between Jack and Derek. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body was frozen in place. Derek took a step forward and Jack didn't hesitate. The sound of the rifle shot echoed through the forest, sharp and final. Derek staggered, clutching his chest as blood blossomed through his shirt. He fell to the ground, his eyes still locked on Sarah, even in death. His lips moved, forming words she couldn't hear, but she knew what he was saying. "I waited for you." Sarah collapsed to her knees, the weight of everything crashing down on her. The fear, the exhaustion, the overwhelming relief. It all hit her at once. Jack crouched beside her, his voice low and steady, pulling her back from the edge of hysteria. "You're safe now," he said. "It's over." But even as he spoke, Sarah knew it wasn't entirely true. Derek might be gone, but the trauma of what had happened, of what he had done, would stay with her. The image of his face, that eerie smile, and the way he had watched her for years without her even knowing, it would haunt her for the rest of her life. The authorities arrived later, the woods swarming with police officers and search teams. They found Derek's body, his twisted obsession finally coming to a tragic and violent end. They took Sarah's statement, though she could barely find the words to explain what had happened, how she had been lured to the Upper Peninsula by someone she barely remembered, only to find herself hunted by a man who had spent years fixated on her. Jack stayed with her the entire time, a silent protector. He didn't ask questions or push her to talk. He simply made sure she was safe until it was all over. As the days passed, Sarah returned to her life, but nothing felt the same. Every shadow, every unfamiliar face in a crowd made her uneasy. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, that Derek's ghost lingered, still waiting for her behind every door she opened. And then there was the blue door, the one from the cabin. It haunted her dreams, always there, vivid and out of place. She couldn't explain why it stood out to her so much, why it felt like the centerpiece of everything that had happened. The memory of it gnawed at her, like a piece of a puzzle she couldn't quite fit together. But perhaps that's what Derek had wanted all along, to leave her with something she couldn't escape, something that would remind her of him forever. Even though he was gone, Sarah knew that she would never fully be free of him. His obsession had bound them together in a way she couldn't undo, not even with his death. And no matter how many doors she closed behind her, there would always be one, the blue door, waiting for her to open it again.